Hello, everybody. This is Don Chum, and I want to welcome you to this edition of the Oticon podcast program. In this edition, we're going to talk about the effort of listening. Let's get started. When someone's talking to another person, there's usually a reason why that conversation is taking place, meaning that the listener is motivated to hear and understand what the other person is saying. One of the things that we know is that listening is not a passive process. Although in casual conversation with people with normal hearing, there's not a lot of effort that has to be put in, but the listener decides whether or not they're going to pay attention to the other person who's talking, and if they pay attention, then they have to be willing to expend a certain amount of effort. In easy conversation with someone who hears well, that effort is barely noticeable. It is almost an automatic recognition of the speech signal. But for a person with normal hearing, if the communication environment is particularly challenging, or if a person has hearing loss, then in order to understand the talker, some amount of effort has to be put forward, and the listener decides just how much effort they're willing to put into the task. One of the hallmarks of sensorineural hearing loss, of course, is the fact that the neural code that's sent up from the periphery to the cognitive system is a compromised signal. And because the information from that neural code is not going to be as clear and distinct as it would be in the situation of normal hearing, then the listener has to compensate. The cognitive system kicks into high gear, and the person doing the listening has to work at putting together the message. As I said, listening should be automatic and effortless. But in the presence of hearing loss, there's always some amount of effort that the patient has to put into the task. Any hearing care professional will quickly recognize reports from patients that they get tired of listening at the end of the day, that listening in the presence of hearing loss is a fatiguing effort, that they just get worn out, and sometimes at the end of the day they just don't want to actually listen anymore, and so they have the tendency to turn off. They have a tendency to zone out because throughout the course of the day they've been put in the position where they have to put in specific effort in order to hear and understand the people talking to them. One of the clear risks of hearing loss then is the natural tendency for the person to start to withdraw from situations where they're forced to use their hearing. In other words, listening becomes such a tiring process that it's just easier not to be in a position where you have to do that listening. And very importantly, this can restrict the patient's access to very important social and occupational and family environments. This self-imposed isolation may be conscious on the part of the hearing impaired listener, or it might be something that they're doing and not even knowing it. They just find that it's easier not to be in a position where they have to put in so much work just to hear and understand speech. Listening effort and fatigue could be measured in a variety of different ways. The simplest way, of course, is simply to ask patients. So in a clinical situation, it is a very obvious sort of discussion to have with the patient to talk about how tired they get if they have to listen all day. One of the advantages of this approach is even though the hearing care professional knows that the patient is probably being fatigued because of the hearing loss, it does help to bond closer to the patient by showing the recognition of the true cost of hearing impairment, which is an increase in effort and an increase in fatigue. Experimentally, a lot of different scales have been used to have patients rate the effort of listening, and it's used, for example, to compare listening aided versus unaided, or to compare listening using different sorts of solutions for patients. There are also different ways to tap into it to get a better idea of the cost. For example, there's a lot of dual task testing that can be done, where the patient's primary task is to do a speech understanding and noise task, and the secondary task is also some sort of cognitive-based task, like a memory task or a reaction time test or some other way of tapping into the cost of the primary task. The idea behind this sort of testing is to show that if you have to put in so much effort into the primary task of hearing and understanding speech, that you have less cognitive reserve left over to do other tasks. For example, committing that information to memory, or interpreting that information, or formulating a logical and sensible response. You can also measure listening effort or fatigue using physiological measures. For example, you can measure cortisol levels, which tend to reflect how much effort a person is putting into a task throughout a longer period of time. You can measure effort via the EEG, and we have been very interested as part of our brain hearing evidence campaign to measure listening effort via pupilometry. And pupilometry has been recognized as to measure how much effort is being put into a cognitive task by a person. As you are concentrating on a task more, as you're putting in more effort to interpret information or to complete a task, the size of your pupils will get larger. This has been observed over a number of decades in many different domains. And it turns out that with the proper experimental controls, you can reliably and robustly measure the diameter of the pupil during a complex listening task. As part of our brain hearing program, we're very interested in understanding the true costs of hearing impairment, and effort is one of those areas that we are very interested in understanding fully. Not only do we want to make sure that patients can hear better, but we want to make sure that they can use their hearing without having to put in excessive amount of work at being a listener. Fundamentally, we want to reduce the effort it takes to live with a hearing loss. For example, in a recent project, we were able to demonstrate that individuals with hearing impairment, with the benefit of Open Sound Navigator active in the products, were willing to expend effort on a speech and noise listening task at 5 dB poorer signal-to-noise ratios than they were when they did not have the benefit of this helping technology. This examination of how hearing-impaired listeners are willing to expend effort is done with the goal in mind of keeping hearing-impaired individuals more engaged in communication situations. Since we know the natural tendency is to withdraw from those situations if they become more difficult, we are very interested to know that if good helping technology such as Oticon Open with Open Sound Navigator will motivate individuals to keep on trying even in more difficult listening situations. We understand the cost of hearing impairment and the tendency for people to withdraw. What we want to be able to establish is that good technology can help hearing impaired individuals stay more engaged with those around them. As always, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to contact me. My email is d.shum@oticon.com, and I want to thank you for your time.